Good afternoon and welcome to the latest of the Downtown Management Forum series that Downtown New Jersey has been running virtually since March. Today we have Mike Berne, who's president of MJB Consulting, and he's going to talk about the new deal, the retail new deal. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with Downtown New Jersey, we are a member-supported nonprofit organization. We provide education and advocacy statewide for downtown revitalization. We also do some efforts to recognize our members. So, you know, all of these resources are provided basically by our dues-paying members. So if you're not a member and you like what you see and you appreciate the technical support and information that we provide to you, we'd appreciate you becoming a member and helping to support our efforts. We've been holding these forums, as you can see, if you go down to the beginning date, since March 20th. Previously, before the shutdown, we did quarterly in-person roundtables. So we have a lot, and all of these, there's recordings and PowerPoints and videos, etc. For almost all of the past forums. So if you missed any, you can go back and watch it or read about it, or at least get the PowerPoints. Stay tuned, save the date. Tentatively, October 2nd, we will be doing the next forum about winterizing your downtown. Isaac Kremer from Metuchen Downtown they've already thought through and are doing a lot with space heaters and working with the fire officials and all that. And we're also working to have a storefront designer for that one as well. And we will be issuing a challenge at the end of that. So stay tuned for more information about that. We're working out the details today, Monday, and we'll get that info out to you soon. And also hold the date for our virtual conference, which will be December 3rd and 4th. So with all that said, I'd like to just give you a brief introduction to who Mike Berne is. He's one of North Jersey's leading experts and a futurist on urban and downtown Main Street districts, as well as the retail industry more generally. As founder and president of MJB Consulting, Michael has amassed more than 20 years of experience in conducting retail market analyses, devising tenanting strategies, and spearheading implementation efforts across the US, Canada, and the UK. Michael is a regular presenter and keynote speaker at industry conferences like IDA, National Main Street, ICSC, and APA, among others. He's also lectured at the University of Pennsylvania, Pratt, CUNY, and University of California, Berkeley. He served as an expert advisory panels for ULI and IEDC, and is often quoted in high-profile publications such as the Financial Times, The Street, and the Washington Post. Michael has also served on the ADA Board of Directors, including a term as vice chair of their executive committee. So without further ado, I am going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Michael to share his perspective about post-pandemic recovery and the retail New Deal. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Courtney. You hear me all right? Okay, let me switch my screen here. Can you see that slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining today. So I know we're going through tough times right now. I'm not going to spend an inordinate amount of time wallowing in all of that. I feel we've probably all done quite a bit of wallowing already, and you can do that on your own time. But you know, just one slide at least on where we are. You know, certainly our downtowns and our main streets have been hit hard because we have been very reliant, indeed over-reliant, on the experiential economy. And by that, I mean food and beverage and entertainment, but also fitness, and various other categories that have been growing industry-wide, but especially in our downtowns and main streets. And obviously, they've sustained a gut punch from COVID. but also the struggles we're having in discretionary soft goods. By that, I primarily mean clothing, shoes, accessories, and you know, to the extent that some of our downtowns have significant numbers of those businesses, they too have been in the doldrums for several months now, with some recent improvement. You've probably also been reading a lot about online's rising market share during all of this. I'll have a lot more to say about that later. But certainly it's reawakened or reinforced anxieties that the end of brick and mortar is nigh. Depressed consumer spending. What's interesting right now is that actually, to some extent, spending's held up better than many economists would have predicted. And even unemployment at 8.4% is not as bad as it could have been. But that said, obviously we're dealing with an economic downturn, and with uncertainty surrounding additional federal stimulus measures, there's no reason to believe that spending is going to rebound substantially anytime soon. And then finally, business closures. Again, the damage here thus far has been not as bad as was originally projected. If you put much stock in Yelp data, which, you know, I do not necessarily, but if you put much stock in Yelp data, they're saying roughly 50 to 70,000 retail businesses across the country closed permanently between March 1st and August 31st, which all things considered seems like a pretty low number, especially when you compare it to the number of retail businesses that close in an average year. But that said, again, the worst might still be ahead of us. Merchants, small businesses are undoubtedly feeling quite fatigued right now. So again, don't want to spend too much time on the despondency. I want to kind of turn the conversation a bit from what you've probably been hearing and reading, because all of that's right now. And what we're seeing among many economic forecasters, what we always seem to see from them, is projections that assume the future will simply be an extrapolation of the present. And the thing is, in retail, it never quite works that way. In fact, the one thing of which we can be sure of is that the future will not simply be an extrapolation of the present. And that's especially the case now, when the present is so very unusual. And we are being forced to act in certain ways for the simple reason that we really don't feel like we have all that much of a choice. What we can say with certainty is that the future will take many unforeseen turns. It will zig and it will zag. There will be what are known as second order effects, outcomes that are set in motion by the outcomes of our initial actions and behaviors. And then third order effects, one iteration further. So when I hear the expression the new normal, I must say I tend to hear it like nails on a chalkboard, because there never has been such a thing as a new normal in retail, and there certainly is not one now. So, you know, there's a lot of noise out there is my point. And I want to encourage you to try to ferret out that noise to the extent that you can. I'll give you just one example. I was in New York City, living and working in Manhattan, 9/11, and most of us remember the narrative right after that, right? No one's ever going to want to fly again. No one's going to want to work in an office tower again. No one's going to want to gather in a large crowd again. Everyone's going to cocoon, right? We're all going to spend time in our homes, in our apartments, never leaving. Always spending our money on outfitting our own personal and family space. Well, what happened after that? And obviously COVID and 9/11 are very different. My point merely is that the narratives you hear now, even the surveys that you see now, saying what people are gonna do in the future, are very much influenced by where they are today. And those kinds of responses can change quite dramatically over not an especially long period of time. I don't believe that people have short memories about everything, but certainly if you look at the track record with consumer spending, they tend to. So what I'm going to be, so that's just one example. And what I'm going to be focusing on today, as opposed to some of the other presentations you might have heard as part of this forum, I'm going to be focusing today on more what's ahead of us in the longer term. Not what's right in front of us, but what's ahead of us in the longer term. Because I fear that that's sometimes being missed, understandably, as we're trying to triage for the present. But we need to be aware of these broader trajectories and contours and how we as downtowns and main streets will need to prepare for them. So let's go through each of those 5 points of despondency I started with, and let's unpack them a bit, dig a little deeper. This experiential economy, will it remain in the longer term? Well, maybe. It's not yet clear. The industry seems to think so. At least if you listen to developers and brokers, there's the expectation that we'll all go back to spending money at restaurants, going to large format entertainment venues once this is in the rearview mirror. I'm not entirely certain that it will remain to the extent that it existed. There were signs that the experiential economy had started to teeter even before COVID-19 arrived. And there's a few other factors that you might want to consider. One, we have generational change. All of us have been spending so much time and energy in the last decade trying to figure out these damn millennials. And well, now that's changing because millennials are entering family formation stage. Many of them were starting to move to the suburbs even before COVID. And so we're going to have a new generation in a lot of our downtowns and main streets, depending on where they are. If they're more urban, it's going to be more of the Generation Z. If they're more suburban, it's going to be more of these millennials. And that's going to dictate what retail strategies you might want to be embracing. Also, there's been and one point about that, Generation Z, to the extent that we really can understand their preferences, they tend not to be foodies. They're far more money conscious. Their primary interest is in fast, frictionless, on-demand food service, right? Which to me sounds a lot like fast casual and not sit down. So the era of the chef-driven sit-down restaurant, which was already very vulnerable, this next generation might not be embracing that to the extent that this past one did. Also, it's interesting, during COVID, there have been boomlets in home cooking appliances, in-house fitness equipment. These are the sorts of things that, if they stick, could definitely have impacts on what kinds of retail we should expect in the downtowns and main streets of tomorrow. I'm not necessarily saying that they will. That remains an open question. Anchor prospects. What I mean by that is that some of the anchors that our downtowns and main streets were still relying on, even in the last several years, there's a lot of uncertainty even there. Take movie theaters for one example. A number of our main streets still have smaller historic theaters that might be showing or might have been showing movies. Obviously, they've been closed for several months now and only recently starting to reopen. But more problematically, if you've been following the news, is the closing of what's called the theatrical window. Theatrical window is the time between when a movie is released in the movie theaters and when it's first available on demand or streaming. And that's historically been about 2.5 months. In a recent deal between AMC and Universal Studios, that window was dropped to 17 days, right? So what impact that will have on the movie theater industry going forward, which was already a bit uncertain, with Netflix and Amazon Video and the like, is an open question. Then again, I believe people have been predicting the demise of the movie theater since the 1950s. So I'm not exactly one to bet against it. It's proved remarkably resilient over the years. But my point is just that large-scale entertainment venues in general aren't a fixture aren't permanent necessarily. And that could have impact on this experiential economy. On the bright side, there has always been, and there always will be, a need for third places, and arguably even more of a need post-COVID. And these typically take experiential form, whether it's coffee houses, bars, diners, and so that seems to be something that we can rely on to a greater degree. Discretionary soft goods. What's the longer term future there? Right now, right in front of us, it's pretty bleak. The reality though is that we're paying a little too much attention to the retailers themselves and not the consumers, because in the end, we're always gonna buy clothing. We're always gonna buy shoes. We're always gonna buy accessories. That's not necessarily gonna change. Now the players who sell that merchandise might change, but the demand will not. We might have stopped buying those sorts of items during COVID for understandable reasons, but I don't expect that to last. And what's interesting right now is that there are structural changes going on in these categories that will create market vacuums which downtowns may be able to fill. I'll say more about that a little later, but for right now, I'll just give you the example of bookstores. It was fascinating to me, Amazon obviously did a number on the book superstores. We lost Borders entirely. Barnes & Noble is kind of a glimmer of its former self. And then what happened? Well, in a complete surprise to most everyone, the number of independent bookstores actually increased every year between 2010 to 2019. It jumped about 50% overall. And what I speculate happened is that there was suddenly a market vacuum and independent bookstores rushed in. Whether that will happen in other categories, perhaps fashion, and offer new kinds of tenant prospects for downtown is something to keep a watch on. Now you might say, wait, all of that's going online, right? Well, not so fast. These are actually the categories that I would argue are among the more insulated from e-commerce. And let me get into e-commerce a bit, because that's always the elephant in the room. And the tenor of the conversation about how online's taking over the world has only gotten louder. I don't know if tenor can get louder, but in any event, you get my point. It's only gotten louder during COVID. And what I want to remind people about is there's a sensuality to retail, right? And what I mean by that primarily is see, touch, feel, or perhaps with food, smell. And that plays a larger role than we're really giving it credit for. And that is not something which can easily or at all translate into online. You might have read that Amazon is the largest seller of clothes in the United States now, which is technically true. But if you look at that slide on the at that image on the upper right, and this was for 2016, but it's pretty much held for the years since, you'll notice that their best sellers are tube socks, are t-shirts, are tighty-whitey underwear, what we call basics. They have not made much of an incursion into true fashion. I don't expect they ever will, partly because of this see, touch, and feel aspect, but also because for many of us, shopping is leisure. And this is one of the biggest complaints I have about the narrative regarding e-commerce and about digital tools more generally, is that the inconveniences that they purportedly make unnecessary also happen to be the stuff of life. We like doing this stuff, right? Remember, many of us like going shopping in a real store with real merchandise, right? Some of us even like going to the grocery store, especially now that grocery stores, thanks to largely to Whole Foods, have become a lot more appealing in the last decade or two. There's more of a drama, a theater to it, better lighting, more salivating displays. And I don't know about you. I know this is very subjective and it's based on a sample of one, but I found the experience of online grocery shopping to be neither user-friendly, efficient, nor the least bit fun. I do it now because I kind of have to, but will I keep doing it afterwards? Not a chance. But the biggest point to all of this, and I think the most important one for e-commerce's future, is that it's one big money loser. Most people don't know this, but online shopping is not good for the bottom line of retailers. It can be very good for the top line, the gross sales for many retailers, but it is not good for the bottom line, profit and loss, for virtually all retailers, even Amazon. Let me say a little bit more about that. For one thing, there's not really much impulse shopping. And it's been said that retail basically rises or falls, it survives or fails based on impulse shopping. Not on what you go to the store for, but what they can make you buy in addition. And that's very hard to translate to the digital realm. So as a result, in-store customers are always more profitable than online ones. But more to the point, the costs of online retail are enormous and far exceed the costs of brick and mortar retail for three main reasons. One, there's a cost of shipping. If you think about it, forever we've gone to the store, we've bought merchandise, and then we bring it home to our individual residences, right? Well, now we're asking the retailer to absorb the cost of delivering it to our homes. And the retailer can't just send all of that to one place, right? They have to send it, each package, to individual homes. And if you can imagine the cost of that, right? Shipping costs are enormous for online shopping. Secondly, customer acquisition. Having a website doesn't really help much if no one knows you're there. So how do you make sure people know you're there? Well, one way is to pay basically the ransom of advertising on the Facebook, Google oligopoly, or or you could try to get on one of the larger marketplace platforms like Amazon's, although there's pluses and minuses to that. But customer acquisition, especially once you get past the early adopters, is a challenge. And finally, returns. Merchandise bought in-store is returned about 9% of the time. When it's bought online, it's returned about 30 to 40% of the time, for obvious reasons. And retailers can't simply restock a lot of that, right? That's another cost. So those three costs combined, again, make this an undeniable money loser for virtually every online retailer. So you ask about Amazon. Amazon actually only recently started to eke out a tiny profit on e-commerce. You might wonder, well, how is that possible? Well, actually, almost all of Amazon's profit is from cloud computing and to a lesser extent, advertising. Until last year, they had lost money on e-commerce, which is unbelievable considering its scale. Even how big, I mean, they control 40% of online market share, right? 2 out of every 5 online purchases is Amazon. And yet they, after 20 some odd years, finally eked out a small profit on it. Wayfair, last quarter, because of the unusual circumstances we're now in, finally turned its first profit in over 20 years. So pure play online retail itself is unsustainable. And what most retailers have figured out is it only works if it is accompanied by a physical footprint, right? And so that's why a lot of the so-called digitally native brands that opened in the early 2010s, many of them cockily proclaiming they'll never have to open a physical store, have indeed started to open physical stores, and actually quite aggressively. If you think about the Warby Parkers and the Caspers and the Bonobos and the Untuckits of the world, right? But even Amazon, we've seen the last 3 years, ever since they acquired Whole Foods, they have started to get very aggressive with building a brick and mortar footprint, right? Whether it's through books, whether it's through their 4-star concept, whether it's with all these experiments with grocery. Just last week, they opened the first of their new mid-market grocery banner, which will be coming to communities near you in the very near future, right? It's called Amazon Fresh, right? And they're doing that because they realize they are way behind Walmart when it comes to having a brick and mortar footprint that can help them to rationalize the high costs of online grocery selling, right? And so they need to create that footprint for the whole thing to work on a financial level. But even independently owned businesses, and this is what's kind of really refreshing, is that this crisis has forced a lot of independently owned businesses to finally make that investment in building some sort of digital infrastructure. They've been forced to adapt, and new platforms have emerged or have grown considerably as a result of that, whether it's the undisputed market leader, Shopify, or more locally with Beyond Main, which operates digital marketplaces for small businesses in downtowns. They're working right now in one of the communities where I'm involved in downtown Westfield, for instance. And so this whole clicks and bricks is clearly the model of the future. And indeed, if you read the annual reports of even the largest retailers in the United States during COVID, you'll read two things. One, thank God we had an existing digital infrastructure, right, to pick up when the stores had to close. And two, thank God we had stores as a way of at least making the numbers work a little bit better. We could do curbside pickup. We could ship orders from the store rather than from a more distant warehouse, right? Thank God we had both. And if nothing else, this has confirmed that both need to be part of the equation going forward. Depressed spending. And what's the long-term future there? Well, I don't think it's new at this point to say there will undoubtedly be a lot of pent-up demand once we see the end of the tunnel on this one. But also what will help a lot of inner ring and suburban downtowns is, again, what I was describing before, the suburbanization of the enormous millennial generation, right? A lot of them are heading into childbearing years, outfitting their new starter homes. And again, there are a lot of them. And so going forward, that should have an impact on spending in a lot of our downtown and Main Street districts. Now, the next point is, we've been hearing for years now that people no longer want to buy things, they want to have experiences. Well, now there aren't many experiences they can have. And so temporarily, at least, there actually has been, and that's part of the reason why retail spending is not greater to the extent that was initially projected. A number of consumers, certainly far from all, but a number of consumers are no longer spending on trips. They're no longer dining out all that much. Instead, what they've been spending on is home decor, home improvement. And you start to wonder whether there will be some shift back from experiences to goods going forward. Not a huge one, but enough to make a difference. Finally, I don't really have any doubts about the American consumer in the longer term because, frankly, it's our national pastime. You've undoubtedly seen charts like this one, which show how much retail space per capita we have compared to other advanced economies. The differences are quite stark, and the data is usually provided as part of the argument for why we're over-retailed. I'm not going to deny that we're over-retailed. And so that number, 24 square feet per capita, probably will and should come down a bit. But the other way to look at this chart is that we really like to shop more than most anywhere else, right? Consumer spending accounts for 2/3 of our GDP. If you think about that for a second, 2/3 of our GDP. So once we get past what we're in now, once COVID's in the rearview mirror, I don't have much in the way of concern about the recovery of the American consumer. Finally, business closures, right? And obviously that's hit downtowns and main streets even harder because we were so reliant on the experiential economy, because we do have higher shares of independently owned businesses. And so in the near term, I don't think we can sugarcoat it. There probably are going to be elevated levels of storefront vacancy in the short term. Again, if you trust Yelp figures, there's been about 20,000 permanent restaurant closures, about 3,500 permanent bar and nightclub closures, 17,500 shop closures, 7,000 beauty salons closures, 2,600 fitness studios closures between March 1 and August 31st. Again, not as bad as I would have expected for nationwide figures, but again, you know, we still might have some more pain ahead of us. That said, again, let's look to the longer term future, right? As harsh as it might be to say, there's some market Darwinism at work here. The percentage of small business owners who think they can continue operating under current conditions for more than a year has almost doubled in the last 3 months. And one way of reading that is to say that, well, this separates the wheat from the shaft, right? That the ones who have been able to survive this long, who have been resourceful enough or had enough of a cushion to get through 6 months of reduced to no traffic, look, maybe these are the strongest of the lot. And the attrition rate might be declining going forward. Again, that's just a theory. But what I think is certainly more likely is that you are going to have, over time, lower rents and more eager landlords. Because frankly, landlords have lost a lot of leverage in all of this. I'm not saying this applies to each and every landlord, but most savvy landlords realize it's probably not that smart right now to evict a tenant that they think will be able to stabilize in the longer term, because it's not as if they have loads and loads of alternatives waiting to take that space, right? Again, I would never overestimate the ability of landlords to see the writing on the wall. They don't always. They're not always that sophisticated. But on the whole, I think you could say that they should be more receptive than they have been. Also, the upside of a lot of restaurants closing is that there'll be a lot of spaces with existing kitchens. And if you know anything about food and beverage, you know that that is gold, right? Because building a kitchen from scratch is one of the biggest costs a new restaurateur faces. And to the extent that they could find spaces where that already exists, it is that much easier to restart a food and beverage use in that space. Also, and this has been proven time and again through history, periods of high unemployment tend to lead to periods of increased entrepreneurialism. If you look at some of the biggest businesses in our country, a lot of them started during economic downturns. Apple started in the late 1970s. That was not an especially propitious time for business, if you remember, right? And indeed, after the Great Recession, there was a considerable uptick in entrepreneurialism. Finally, there are going to be a lot of opportunities amidst industry transition, as I kind of alluded to before. You know, the standard bearers in categories are disappearing. Market share is now up for grabs. There's also an acceleration of what's called direct-to-consumer retail, with the long-time platforms for distribution, like department stores, falling by the wayside and leaving a lot of brands with no outlets for their goods. So an increasing number of them have been choosing to take control of their fate and open new stores leading up to COVID. And I expect that to resume. in the longer term. And downtowns might be able to benefit indirectly from some of these trends in ways that I'll describe later. Now, here's a challenge that we face. The best stuff in downtowns and main streets had started in recent years already to be co-opted by more conventional suburban formats. And this is always what happens, right? Something goes from hip to trendy to mass. That is the cycle. Like the chef-driven foodie movement, now appearing in the form of artisanal food halls in enclosed malls. On the right there, that looks like something straight out of New York City. That's actually the rendering for the Munchies Food Hall at American Dream Mall, right? Or the craft maker movement, right? Now showcased in stores like Beta on the left, which sit in luxury malls like Short Hills, right? And lifestyle centers and grocery anchored strips will also probably become even more aggressive in this regard as a way to further differentiate their offerings in the absence of more traditional anchors, which means that downtowns and main streets will need to once again do what they do best: incubate the new concepts and formats that will transform mass culture of tomorrow. And they'll have to invent a new paradigm, just like they did a quarter century ago when the experiential economy first took hold. So what might that new retail paradigm consist of? Well, our downtowns had already started to function, look, and feel a bit differently in the last decade or two, as even suburbanites started to want their own little patches of walkable urbanity. I've spoken extensively in the past about a phenomenon that I call the suburbanization of hip. Again, as millennials enter family formation stage and move outward, either out of preference or because of cost, they've started to transform the downtowns and main streets of the communities to which they've relocated. But unlike the suburbanizers of the past, they've brought their urban sensibilities with them. And we see this across the New York City metropolitan area, along the Hudson River in Westchester, in Nyack, the Brooklyn on the Hudson, which it was tagged, and in towns across northern and central New Jersey. That's why we've started to see hip brands like Warby Parker materialize in places like downtown Westfield, in addition to Garden State Plaza, right? And why you have cafes in the suburbs that look like the image on the left. That's Boxwood Coffee Roasters, a small chainlet with locations in Summit, Westfield, and Florham Park. Looks like something, again, straight out of Brooklyn. Now, what we're also getting with generational change, if you listen close, is a different and far more tolerant attitude of the inconveniences of downtown and main street settings. So even if there's a homeless person or two, or even if you have to park a little bit further away from your destination, those are not deal breakers to the extent that they might have been in the past. And I think that's something to keep a watch on. As you know, those sorts of issues consume a lot of our time and energy in downtowns and main streets. Maybe they shouldn't to the degree that they have going forward. So what does the retail mix start to look like in the years ahead? Well, here's some initial thoughts. As I said, third place venues, maybe we'll have fewer restaurants and bars overall, but still ones that serve this important social purpose, especially to the extent that work from home sticks past the pandemic. As all those people toiling away at their laptops in their homes will want or need to get away at certain points of the day, and they'll likely gravitate to such places in order to get a little shot of connection. Quick service, fast casual eateries, that's kind of the wave of the future. They're far more efficient and profitable to operate. They're easier to launch. There's a reason why Danny Meyer decided to focus more of his attention on Shake Shack rather than the fine dining establishments for which he first became known. I mentioned franchises here because economic downturns usually translate not just to increased entrepreneurialism, but increased entrepreneurial interest in franchise concepts. And this one is already proving no different. So I would not be surprised to see a lot of interest from quick service, fast casual food franchises in your downtowns and main streets the months and years ahead. Treasure hunt shopping. The treasure hunt is an experience that really lends itself to in-person shopping, does not translate easily to online, which is why the TJ Maxx's, the Burlingtons, the Rosses of the world continue to grow and show strong earnings throughout the last decade, even amidst the rise of e-commerce. You know, and that's probably going to accelerate in the months and years ahead, as well as other forms that kind of mimic that sort of experience, whether it's vintage, secondhand, and consignment, which had already been enjoying increased mass acceptance, and which will definitely align with an economic downturn, as well as the interest in circular retail, as it's called, which focuses on sustainability. Brick and mortar platforms, I kind of alluded to these before, you know, these are basically next generation department stores. They're basically playing the same role. They provide a platform for brands, you know, up and coming or otherwise, that do not or cannot open their own storefronts, right? And there's a number of these which have emerged in recent years for a lot of digitally native brands that want to try brick and mortar, right? Neighborhood goods, show fields, those are just a few of them. Even Beta is a form of that. Now, there's not many of them, and they're still mostly propped up by venture capital funding, but you can create your own. In fact, downtowns have been creating their own for a while now in the form of retail incubators, right? So brick and mortar platforms. Pamper niche services, that refers, you know, to the beauty salons and the, you know, and the spas of the world, other such services. I mention those partly because they tend to not require an enormous amount of startup capital, nor involve huge overhead. So especially in the coming months, they might be one of the, you know, the kinds of tenants that you'll see more and more of. And finally, healthcare retail, not just because of the baby boomer bulge in the suburbs, but also just the sheer size of the industry and the more retail forms that it has been taking in recent years. These are just some initial thoughts. But it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for every downtown or Main Street. As always, it will depend on the specifics. And what's important to keep in mind here is that retail is not just about goods and services, right? And it will be even less so going forward. Rather, retail has always been, particularly in downtowns and main streets, about aspiration, right? About how we want to see ourselves as individuals, as consumers, as communities, and how we want others to see us, right? And the problem is that the market, the free market, does not always go where we want it to, right? And we really have to take our cues from it and lean into what it is telling us, which I call aspiration filtered through the prism of reality, right? What aspirations can we realistically realize in our downtowns, right? And that's the stuff of what I call nuanced market positioning, an exercise which far too few downtowns ever truly or meaningfully undertake. And that's a whole session in itself. But for now, I'll just say one point about it. We often assume that everything that's going on in our downtowns, that's our market, right? We've got new mid-rise apartment complex in our downtown. Well, look at all those new consumers. Well, the reality is that for most of our downtowns, given the scale at which they're built, which reflects a much earlier time in our retail evolution, just one mid-rise apartment complex, or even several, are just a drop in the bucket of what those downtowns need to survive and thrive, right? Ultimately, they're going to rise and fall also on the basis of the rest of your community, as well as other adjacent communities. That is a broader trade area, right? You know, the way retail works, it doesn't obey municipal or district boundaries, right? You have to consider the trade area as a whole, which is not always coterminous with those boundaries. And you got to consider what kind of retail mix is going to resonate with that broader trade area. And you have to figure that out within the context of the larger competitive ecology. That is to say, what other places can consumers and tenants go other than your downtown or Main Street? You know, and how do you match up? How are you differentiated? Are you differentiated, right? And of course, that ecology, as I said earlier, is very much in transition right now with the decline of malls, the decline of big box power centers. There's a lot of movement even there. This all has to be pretty carefully analyzed and synthesized in order to really get at what kind of retail will be sustainable going forward. Okay, lastly, I want to get into a little bit of what this all means from a practical point of view. And, you know, I've written about a new retail New Deal coalition. I think given the realities of municipal budgets right now, in a number of places, it might have to fall to Main Street organizations to take the lead role, especially if you're a special improvement district, because generally speaking, that's a revenue source that's a little less elastic than the ones that municipalities typically rely on. That said, there's a very good case to be made that this has to remain a municipal priority. Obviously, there's less money to play with. But that said, economic development is probably among one of the last functions that should be cut, just given its importance from a fiscal point of view, but also because downtowns and Main Streets in particular are the faces of our community. When I was talking about aspiration before, think about what a downtown or a Main Street, think about its symbolic importance to how a community feels about itself, how it's viewed by outsiders, by visitors, by would-be investors. Think about the jolt that downtown Newark got when Whole Foods opened there. For better or for worse, we as human beings tend to judge communities on the basis of their retail because we really don't have much else to base it on, right? We don't know what's going on upstairs. We don't necessarily know who's living in houses. We can see the retail, right? And we will draw conclusions, even subconsciously, based on the retail that we see. And finally, other stakeholders, foundations, if you have ones in your midst, and institutions, but also community banks, community development financial institutions, as well as fintechs. For those of you who are not familiar with what a fintech is, fintechs are basically tech startups that are using technology to develop or improve financial products and services. And they've been particularly active in working on ways to improve access for smaller scale clients, whether those are businesses or individuals. And they too can play and need to play a role in this. Now, we've obviously been very focused in our districts on triaging to save as many existing small businesses as we can, and I am not saying that that should stop. That needs to continue apace, but we are also needing to walk and chew gum at the same time. And that means building and nurturing an ecosystem for the creation of new small businesses that can fill the vacated storefronts, right? And that can be, there's a role that can be played on a number of levels. Not just with helping on startup capital, build outs, even in the best of times, are something which it's very hard for new small businesses to fund on their own. But also risk mitigation. What's interesting to me is that there are programs that can be retrofitted to provide almost like financial backstops or sort of loan guarantee that can help to mitigate the perception of risk among entrepreneurs, right? And I think those are particularly intriguing right now as we're going through this current trauma. Platforms for lowering barriers of entry. I kind of mentioned that earlier, whether that's retail incubators, there's a number of excellent models, container villages, ghost kitchens, fashion truck pods, using public property and public spaces for that purpose, but also matchmaking for co-locators. This was happening even before COVID, where retailers would join together to share the cost of higher rent spaces. And so you'd have a storefront with 2 to 4 businesses. And to the extent that perhaps you could serve as a matchmaker for different entrepreneurs that might be interested in doing that. That could be a useful role to play. I also think that there's an important role if you're going to make these sorts of assistance available to requiring as a condition of such assistance that recipients take part in retail resiliency trainings. We still have 36% of small businesses across the country that do not sell online at all, right? And such a training regimen could help to kind of modernize small businesses that really need to do so. And finally, on-call business services, whether it's legal accounting services contracted out by SIDS to help lower costs for small businesses. Again, all of this is part of a package that can be used to just make it easier and more likely for new small businesses to emerge that will fill some of these vacant storefronts. Municipalities, SIDS, other sorts of nonprofits also have a role to play in creating district-wide collateral. And this has always been an important purpose for such stakeholders. Because if you think about it, landlords and brokers, they market specific spaces. And that's actually all they're incentivized to fill, right? You, however, can have a role to play in selling the downtown or Main Street more holistically, more broadly, in terms of what it is. And don't forget, there's a lot of value to that. To the extent that you can reach out to would-be tenants, tenant rep brokers, investors, and change the narrative about your town, right? That can be invaluable, right? I've seen it in other places where I've done this sort of work, where downtown Berkeley, which is my part-time home in California, is an example of a downtown community which really suffers in terms of its perceptions within the private sector based on an identity that really was developed 50 years ago. And what we endeavored to do was to kind of change that perception, kind of change that conversation in today's language. And such collateral can be invaluable in doing that. Also, prospecting for tenants. What I think was, and this was something I've been worrying about for years. I just felt like our downtowns were getting so hooked on food and beverage, and it was leaving us vulnerable. And I actually thought we were vulnerable maybe to a terrorist attack. I didn't imagine it was a viral contagion, but it works just as well, if not better. I think as we rebuild our retail mixes, we need to aim towards greater diversification. And the problem is that the whole system of filling space kind of tends towards what's already worked, right? And so it results eventually in an oversupply of anything. Frozen yogurt used to be really cool and new, and then we got too many of them, right? That happens in category after category. And what municipal and nonprofit stakeholders can do is to try to create some alternatives by prospecting for tenants and then feeding them to landlords and brokers. It's not something that every such organization should be doing, but for certain types of organizations, it could be a very important role in terms of ensuring that we don't just double down on what's working now with the inevitable result that we'll eventually have too much of it, but that we keep that diversification, because as with any investment, diversification is the key to mitigating risk, right? Convening for a catalytic project. I'm not saying catalytic projects. I understand the climate we're in. However, a catalytic project, maybe a municipal or nonprofit stakeholder is not in a position to invest in an actual real estate project, but they are the ones that can convene all the different players, right? And again, make those matches that could lead to something more. And to the extent that municipalities aren't really even in a position to provide financial incentives, there are other incentives that they can offer, whether it's expedited permitting. For a lot of developers and retailers, that's even more important, right? And these catalytic projects in the downtown can be valuable just from a symbolic point of view as kind of an expression of recovery and resiliency. But also, not insignificantly, there are actually quite a few larger format anchors which are on the prowl right now. I wrote about it in an article called Greedy While Others Are Fearful, which is a take on the famous Warren Buffett proverb that, you know, you should be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. Right now, there's a lot of people and retailers that are fearful, and there are ones which are saying this is the time to secure desirable real estate at cut rate prices. Right? And those are the ones that really could help to drive foot traffic for this emerging new collection of small businesses that we hope to catalyze. Finally, partnering on a land bank. Again, this might be more of a convening role, but I think right now, if we look at the experience of the Great Recession and how afterwards the slew of foreclosures in a lot of communities were followed up by a lot of private equity acquisitions of single family homes, which then became rentals. And I wondered whether something similar might be on the horizon for commercial real estate. We might want to act aggressively to make sure that certain key properties, at least, remain in friendly hands. If even those hands are a private sector actor like a community bank or a foundation. Because, you know, once those are lost, you know, the process kind of plays out the way it will. I realize these are quite aggressive, but I think that's what the times call for. Edgier marketing and branding. One thing I've been saying to communities, you know, in your marketing and branding, doubling down on those consumers that stuck with you at the depths, right, in March and April, that were still getting takeout, or, you know, that really in the bleakest of moments, they were there for downtown, right? But also leveraging the power of guilt. This is not something we've always been so comfortable doing, but I think there's a real case that needs to be made now to people that if we're gonna rescue our downtowns and main streets, we gotta walk the walk, right? This New Yorker cartoon is one of my favorite. It shows a bookstore owner walking into his bookshop, saying hello to the resident who lives upstairs, who is in the process of receiving an Amazon package, right? In our marketing, our branding, not being afraid to leverage what downtowns and main streets mean in a way that actually gets people to spend accordingly. I think in the aftermath of COVID-19, when we've seen so many small businesses in such desperate positions, if not closed entirely, that's something which can be extra effective. And finally, owning an identity. You know, again, this is to some degree beyond my expertise, but I just find that a lot of the branding that's done in our downtowns, whether it appears on banners or not, it's very generic and it doesn't really say anything, or at least it doesn't say anything vis-a-vis the competitors. How do we differentiate ourselves versus all the other downtowns that say the same things on their banners, right? Really owning an identity, I think is something that resonates in this day and age in particular. Finally, loosening the regulatory regime. We should allow for creative destruction. It's a scary thing. We're scared of how retail mixes will change over time. Even in the best of times, we worry about losing our most cherished businesses, and we all have. I've lost my favorite coffee houses, and it's painful, very painful, and it's scary. We don't know what they'll be replaced by. But we have to have more faith in that process, because while free markets fail on several levels, and I will certainly argue that, on this one, they generally prove their worth over time. Just a couple of examples I'll give you about the inherent dynamism of retail if we let it evolve of its own terms. Barcade, some of you might be familiar with, they're in downtown Jersey City. I attracted them to downtown New Haven. And what we found was that the zoning code treated anything with an arcade kind of like these were the arcades of the 70s and 80s, when they were considered, rightly or wrongly, places for, you know, pedophiles, basically. And the zoning codes reflected that. You know, we are 50 years from that. times have changed. Regulatory regimes need to change more quickly with them. In Westfield, there's been some pushback because there's a new tattoo parlor opening up, a tattoo studio called American Dream, right? And one thing I remind people is, 49% of millennials have one or more tattoos, all right? These are not the drunken sailors or the gang members of yesterday, right? These things change in their meanings, and they need to change also in the way we regulate them. Right? And I think this is, again, another generational question, that the loudest voices on a lot of our downtowns and main streets are people who have been there for a while, right? And so I'm going to leave you with one last quote, because it really brings this point home. And some of you who've heard me speak might have heard me say it before, and I know you all can read, but I'll read it anyway. I just read a story about how brunch is over, a friend says. One of the commentators said, brunch isn't over. It's over for you. Just because you stop staying out late and sleeping in and then stumbling over to Cafe Orland for a Bloody Mary and eggs at 2 p.m. doesn't mean no one else is doing that now or doing something that feels just as exciting. If you're complaining about the East Village or New York in general being dead, I think it's worth considering the possibility that, yes, it is over for you. But for plenty of others, the city is as full of potential and magic as it was in 1977 or 1964 or 1992, or whenever you last walked down the street and felt like it belonged only to you. Now, this was about East Village in New York City. And granted, things change quicker in New York City than they do most anywhere else. But I think the point holds. And I think we gotta be, when we're thinking about the next iteration of our downtowns and main streets, we gotta be aware that change is gonna happen. Change is not necessarily a bad thing. And that ultimately, we will get back to an equilibrium. But it might look very different. It probably will look very different from the one that we had before. So on that note, I will bring it back to Courtney.
Great, thank you, Mike. That was wonderful. I had high expectations and you exceeded them. So thank you very much. If you don't mind, stop sharing so that people can kind of put Brady Bunch view up on their world. Yes. I was about to say, Michelle, you had a question. I was going to go to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering, are we allowed to prospect for tenants since we don't own the real estate?
That is, Courtney, should I just respond?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a fair question. So it's true that municipalities, nonprofits, we generally do not own and lease retail space. This is almost always in support of landlords and brokers. It requires that you actually ensure you have their buy-in beforehand. But in a lot of communities where I've done this, there is a real openness, especially when prospects are not many. As long as they're getting their commissions, brokers are happy with it. In fact, having handed pre-qualified leads on a platter for free, they're all over that. And landlords too. Landlords, they just want to fill a space. They don't really care where it comes from necessarily. I don't recommend this, but they would actually prefer not having to pay a commission. But I do believe that you have to involve brokers in this, because in the end, they are some of your best or worst ambassadors, right? So yes, it's a fair question. And in the end, we have to convince other people, the real stakeholders, to take our advice, as with most everything else we do. But yeah, it can be done and has had success in a number of places.
Remy, could you, I see that you're there and you put on your video, you want to tune in too, because she's one of New Jersey's few downtown, and not just because she's few, she's very successful recruiters for Haddonfield.
Yeah, I'm actually the retail coordinator for Haddonfield. I work for the partnership for Haddonfield, which is funded by our bid. And my job is to proactively prospect and try to maintain our mix.
Yep.
I do that by networking with brokers and landlords as well. It works well when it works well, I guess is the way to put it. If someone's had a space empty for a great length of time, the landlord will be less likely to keep holding out for what I feel or the bid feels would be a better tenant. But I've had this job for over 8 years, and the previous person had 10 years. And Haddonfield, I believe we have a good mix. As you said, a lot more food places are trying to come in, and we're trying to hold on to our retail spots and not convert them, but it does work.
Perfect that you were on the call, because yeah, and I think she makes good. Remy, is it?
Ramy, yeah.
Ramy. Oh, sorry, Ramy.
You make a very good point that yeah, it's not for everyone, right? I mean, obviously, it's usually much harder than people or would-be clients think it is, and it's the long game, right? And sometimes circumstances are such where it really doesn't make sense, either as something that's needed, something that's wanted, or even something that your organization, whatever it may be, has the capacity to do. So that's why I offer that qualifier. But in cases like yours and others, it can be a real powerful support function that the SID or that any downtown Main Street organization can play.
Michelle, I just put in the chat a link to a forum we did back in April. Another concept that we discussed with Marta Person-Villa from Jones Lang LaSalle was the leasing plan for your downtown. And somebody did ask that question in that forum too, going back April. That seems like 5 years ago, right? What do we do with the tenants or the landlords that don't want to play? And it's like, do the low-hanging fruit and deal with the ones that do want to play and do want to give you information and are willing to, and then, the other ones, when they see that your work is being fruitful for them, they'll probably come along, or they won't, and there's just nothing you can do about those guys, right?
Great, thank you. That's great.
Yeah, and I would confirm that. You're never going to get everyone, but you start with the ones who are most likely to be receptive, and landlords are competitive too. They see other landlords landing cool tenants that are creditworthy. Some of them will come around, some you'll never get. But yeah, you don't need everyone, is my point.
Yeah. There's a question from Pamela. What are container villages?
Yes, good question. And I'm sorry if I went through that too quickly. So container villages are basically collections of many different shipping containers, which you might have seen in some communities have increasingly been used as retail spaces. These are literally shipping containers, but they have been retrofitted to serve as kind of incubator spaces. And a container village is a collection of them in one place. So you get some of that sort of synergy from many different businesses in the same location. And communities can do this, certainly on their public spaces. I remember when I was doing some work in downtown Cleveland 2 years ago, there was a big parking lot right near Public Square. It's been sitting there forever, and it's usually only used during the week. And on the weekends, it was city owned. The city would put a bunch of shipping containers there, which businesses would occupy, and it would become kind of like a fair sorts. And, it generated a lot of energy and buzz, and also kind of provide a lower barrier to entry for entrepreneurs, rather than having to sign a lease for a permanent space. Actually, I think that might have been a nonprofit driven initiative, now that I think about it. But anyway, I can get you more information if you want.
Yeah, Jersey City, not for retail, just did one for their homeless population.
Yeah.
So, interesting.
And yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, just go ahead. Just get more questions.
Spencer put in the chat, you talked about oversaturation of a concept as being problematic for main streets. And a pre-COVID craft breweries were increasingly popular as much as an economic development tool as they were as experiential retail. If your opinion, A, were we close to market saturation pre-COVID? And B, how are craft breweries weathering the storm, and do trends suggest that they will be equally popular post-COVID?
Very good question. Many angles to it. Yeah, craft brewing had exploded over the last 2 decades and really surpassed levels of overall market share that many might not have predicted. I mean, you know, there are some surveys which show that craft brewing, broadly understood, is, you know, accounts for almost as much as 20% overall market share in beer, which is far greater market share than, say, artisanal coffee houses or so-called third wave coffee houses. And so it's broken into the mainstream. So to say that we're saturated is, you know, I mean, it can keep going. Now, I think it depends on the market. There are certain markets, especially ones that were early in this movement, that probably had reached a saturation. San Diego is one of the examples that was often cited. Other markets, and I would guess New Jersey, maybe still a little ways from saturation. I think in COVID, what we've noticed is that the craft breweries that also had developed significant, that had already secured some shelf space at grocery stores, obviously, but for obvious reasons, have been able to weather it a little bit better than those that were just basically tap rooms and were relying on their tap rooms for most of their revenue. I do think that it will continue apace. I do think that, you know, mainstream beer is still in the same trouble that it was before in terms of changing tastes. Although there does seem to be some conversations that suggest that the next decade is going to see some reduction in alcohol consumption in favor of, you know, in favor of mocktails and in favor of even lower proof session beers. There's change perhaps afoot within alcohol consumption more generally. But yeah, I think that craft breweries, look, in the end, it's like coffee houses. They sell a drug. And they sell a drug at a pretty good margin. Those are always 2 good things to start with. And so the last point I'll say is what you have been seeing in a lot of these categories, at least pre-COVID, whether it's craft beer, whether it's artisanal coffee, is a lot of the pioneers ultimately being gobbled up by corporate players. You know, in coffee, we've seen it. Blue Bottle was bought by Nestle, for instance. In beer, you know, Budweiser has been on a tear buying a lot of craft brews, and they don't necessarily advertise that they are the new owners. So it's kind of increasingly hard to say which is which. So it's, again, some of that co-opting going on, which might force downtowns and main streets to kind of invent again something that's once more new.
On the craft brewing and the fact that we're not oversaturated in New Jersey quite yet, I think a lot of that has to, yeah. No, and it has a lot to do with our liquor license.
Yeah, laws. That's often what it depends on.
Yeah, because you can't serve food. You can have snacks, but you can't. So we don't get those microbrewery with the great restaurants and the music. They'll do music, but they'll then bring in food trucks or something like that. And stay tuned. We're working on some liquor license stuff along with a bunch of mayors, because we see actually this as an opportunity to maybe finally start to expand our liquor license, you know, process. So there's a question so John, actually, if you want to just unmute yourself, introduce yourself and ask your question, and also the link you were telling me about.
Sure.
there we go.
First off, Mike, thank you. Tremendous presentation. Got a lot out of it.
Thanks.
I have one question for you on what are you seeing on a nationwide, municipal, local, either county, municipality, as best-in-class technical assistance programs being provided by downtown associations, bids, SIDS, something that, you know, if we could beg, borrow, or steal to use for New Jersey small businesses, we'd like to do that. So what are you seeing there? And then as a follow-up, I'd also like to, I'll put this in the chat, but NJEDA, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, is working with the Philly Fed on a small business credit survey for access to capital for small businesses across New Jersey. So I'd like to share that with everybody. But I'll take myself online. I'll post the link to the Philly Fed Small Business Credit Survey. We're hoping to get a lot out of that and wait for your answer. But again, thank you. Great presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, and I can forward you some specific links as to your first question, but I think speaking more generally, the more effective technical assistance tools have seemed to be, can you hear me, Courtney?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. The more effective ones for small businesses tend to be ones that offer a very discrete benefit that they have shown past interest in having. And that's kind of a very generic statement in its own, but I contrast that to many technical assistance programs which aim to provide expertise to merchants that they don't necessarily want or have asked for. And there it's very difficult to get participation because I think, you know, if you think about the personality type of a small business, you know, sometimes there's the response of, well, you're telling me how to do my business? No, thank you. Telling me how to do my, you know, and you know, there's to some degree there's a little bit of you know, an insulting quality to it. Whereas if there's a discrete benefit, whether it's connecting them specifically to new online platforms, or again, specific financial assistance, that tends to go over much better. And I know that's, again, I'm not satisfied with that answer either because it's such a big subject and that was a very general way of answering it. And I could send you some specific links, you know, in a moment. There's one in Detroit, Digital Detroit, which has been very interesting in terms of trying to encourage small businesses to finally make the leap to a digital presence. But anyway, I could send you some more links about that.
No, I'd be much appreciated, especially what you're seeing on a national scene and then best in class. So that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thanks, John. Does anyone else? We've got, I want to be cognizant of people's time, particularly Mike's, who was very generous with us. It's normally we go, you know, an hour and a half on the outside. We have about 7 more minutes till we hit that hour and a half. Does anyone else have something to ask or contribute? Just for those of you who are new to these, this is kind of an exchange of ideas and best practices. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a question. It can also be, or it could be a question for the group. Like, this is what we're doing. Has anyone else done this? Just throwing that out there. If not, though, we will sign off with thanks. Right. Oh, wait, Michelle.
No, I was just going to say thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Courtney, I have one thing.
Okay.
If I could. So full disclosure, I'm Bob Zuckerman, Executive Director of Downtown Westfield, and we're actually working with Mike, and really happy to be doing so. He's providing great input for us and great advice. And it was great to see your presentation today, Mike. I'm wondering about the advent of cooperative stores, and if that's something that you see as a rising trend. I know that Asbury Park has a small bookstore that actually turned into a co-op bookstore. So it's owned, I guess, by the community. And if you think that that's some way that some sort of portending of the future in terms of filling some of these vacancies, and where do you think that's going?
Yeah, that's a really intriguing piece, because I do think what we have seen, at least in some communities with COVID, is a willingness for individuals to actually, put their money where their mouth is. And, one of the examples is, GoFundMe campaigns to keep cherished businesses afloat. Mm-hmm. And to what extent you can continue to tap that with new cooperative models. Now, I think, a word of caution. I think it really is, first of all, co-ops are very difficult in even the best of times, just in terms of creating them and then sustaining them over time. They have worked in a number of places. There are certain cities which have been especially effective. Minneapolis, St. Paul historically has had a major co-op presence, as well as the Bay Area. But they're not easy to pull off, and obviously assume a certain level of financial wherewithal that just simply doesn't exist in a lot of communities, especially amidst an economic downturn. So I think it varies. I think for somewhere like a Westfield, the prospects would be, better than for somewhere else where your base of would-be members is more challenged economically. So I think that's what it is. The other interesting model which you see, and Vancouver's definitely been in the forefront of this, the whole social enterprise model, which are businesses, they're for profit, but for a clearly stated social purpose. And that I expect in certain communities will be a growing trend as well.
Great, thanks.
And so with that, because I realized I just got a pop-up that I have a 1:30 meeting, so.
Oh. One last thing I wanted to add, there's a lot of, I've done a lot of, I think a couple of my articles were included in the initial posting for this. There are other articles there, some more recent, not necessarily dealing specifically with downtowns and main streets, but about the industry more generally. So if you want to go to my LinkedIn page, you'll find those.
I'll find those, I'll post those.
Thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. And just so everybody knows, I will get the web page for this recap up soon. This video will be posted, the PowerPoint will be posted, and my associate, normally the summary, the actual written narrative summary, that takes about a week because we've got to kind of comb through all that. That'll be up there too. And I thank you again, Mike. This was great. And thank you for everybody who showed up. Have a great weekend.
Great weekend, everybody.